we design experiments. An experiment is basically you pick the text you're going to use, depending on what kind of text you're interested in. Say translated versus original, written in a native language versus written in a non-native language, and so on and so forth. And you collect the data basically and compare it. So, for example, a closed site of Lalita is self-translated text. So with a single text, you can do more, of course. You can analyze the vocabulary more in greater detail. You can compare. So, for now, Lalita is a case study of a single text. Another experiment we're doing is the comparative study of Nabokov's Mademoiselle O, which is a kind of unique text because it's the only thing he's ever written in French. The only piece of fiction he wrote in French. And we have 5 versions of the text with very different provenances. So 5 versions of a single text, which is small and easy to navigate. It was a French short story in the beginning, then it became an English short story. Nabokov self-translated with the help of another translator. Then he reworked it for his English autobiography, Objective Evidence. Then reworked again for Russian autobiography, Дорогие берега, and back in English, Speak Memory. And finally, we also found an English translation by a third-party translator of the text, from French into English. Again, a rare occurrence of a translation on Nabokov, not by Nabokov, into a language other than Russian, because he mostly translated himself into English, so people don't really want to compete with him, I suppose. And maybe it doesn't make sense. So another thing is a comparison, so more macro scale, a comparison of Nabokov's original and translated style in English. So here we take one language, and we take novels written in the language versus novels translated or self-translated into the language. And again, instead of self-translation versus rewriting, how does the text change? How do the connections between the words change as the writer is not just translated, but also changing the text while translated. Just to give one example of how this idea of distant versus close reading works, how they play into each other, they kind of flow into each other. So we take Mademoiselle O, and what we did was calculate not just the most common vocabulary, a lot of tools can do that, but most common lemmas. So, for example, in Russian, it's very important because if you just use a tool that's pre-made, they don't usually do that. Every token, say the word черный, черная, черному will be all different tokens. It's hard to navigate that. But have a tool that leads it all, that calculates the lemma. So we have the actual word черный, nominative for all of them. And then what did I do here? I looked at the list of lemmas in this short story in different languages, different versions. And what I see is that in French, a particular word, this is just something that strikes you. You look at the list, and it's just numbers. But you see, for some reason, черный, noir, is on the 98th place for French. But for English, it's on the 216th and 205th places. And then in Russian, 67th. So this is striking. I go and do a search. If I were just reading the story as a literary scholar, I would never notice this problem. I would just read the story. However, now I'm alerted to the fact that there's something going on with черный, with Noir, in that story. First of all, it's pretty important. It's one of the, after all the auxiliary words and prepositions and things that are the most common lemmas in a text. It comes among the meaningful words. It comes among the first in the French and the Russian text. It's clearly very important. However, in the English, this is not the case. So I go and I do search, and these are the occurrences of blackness in the 5 versions of the story. In the French, you see, sortie de noir clair, de lune de l'encrier, I won't read the whole thing, but you see there are 13 occurrences. This is number here. Just so 13 occurrences of noir in the French. You see what they are. Then the story was written in French. Then it's reworked into a short story in English, and suddenly there's much less blackness. There's only 6 occurrences, and also compared to other words, it's pushed back all the way to place to 116. A similar thing happens in the autobiography version. It's still pretty pretty far. And we see actually that the number of occurrences is the same, but one occurrence goes away. So he gets rid of blackness of sleep here, and he introduced another black thing. There's two black horses are not there. So he keeps the amount of blackness constant in a way. Maybe subconsciously between those two texts. But then the Russian version, blackness is again very important. The Russian version was created after the English version, so he reduces the amount of blackness, then he puts it back in again in the Russian. And we see it in the translation. The translator was translating the French, and the place is kind of in between. So he was keeping the amount of blackness from the French. It's still quite important, but not as much as in the French, and definitely not as much as in the Russian. So somehow in the Russian, blackness becomes even more important compared to other words. Fewer occurrences, slightly fewer occurrences, but at higher place than in the French. Despite the fact that the English version was created between those two. And just a fact, and then we can see, for example, in Russian again. Now that I know that there's something going on with black in there, I see that in Russian he uses these two words that have chern in them, chernilnitsa and chernosotiny. Mm-hmm. So again, this kind of contributes somehow to, at least to me, to this importance of blackness in the story, subconsciously at least. And yet I wouldn't have been able to see that otherwise. So some things that we learn from this very quick example. First of all, that Nabokov, there's something interesting going on with the process of writing here. He returns in some symbolic features of the French text, or he returns to them in the Russian, despite the fact that the English version was served allegedly as the basis of the Russian version. We see that there is an interesting balance of words, which must be subconscious, most probably subconscious, with things like Jordan in Russian. So he keeps, as he writes, somehow he keeps that balance. Okay, who would have thought that, when we read it, Mademoiselle, it is a pretty sad story in the end. But you don't think of blackness as contributing to it in this way. But he keeps the balance across languages, changes place with it. And in the two English versions, the balance is the same. And in the Russian, he restores the French somehow. You can look at the translation strategies of the third-party translator. For example, what does he do with the black and noir in the French, which Nabokov doesn't do. So Nabokov's English version doesn't have much blackness in it. The translator's English version does, because he remains faithful to the text. However, the translation's version, he makes a lot of the black and they're more abstract. So in the English of the translator, there's blackness mentioned a lot of times. And not just blackness there, blackness again, quite a few. And another thing that we see is the skin stain, the black skin stain that Mademoiselle has. So this is a story about Nabokov's governess when he was a child, and she has this black skin stain. So in the French, you can see how this evolves. This small feature of the memory of the writer evolves into a symbol, basically, and you can kind of observe this. In the original French, he mentions once, where is it? Les pinces noires. So he mentions the black, I don't know how to call it even. I guess that's what it is. The thing that keeps the pince on the nose. So he mentions that they're black in passing in the French. Then in the English, you can see that it becomes an important feature of the image of the governess in his mind, because he repeats himself twice. And it becomes a black name. However, it's not very. So we see that it becomes important for the writer. However, I guess he's not very happy with the fact that he repeats himself. So here he stops the repetition, takes one out. You only have the one black print, name. Yet in the Russian, the same symbol is still there. It's much more developed than in the French, but it's also much more subtle than in the English. We have pince-nez, черное праве, and then И чеховское пенсне окружало черными ободками для опущенных глаза. So it is back to two appearances. It's definitely important. But he works on the way he puts it in there. It's much more subtle. It's not черное пенсне anymore. And some other things that I partly mentioned. So you see, you get a list of numbers. The list of numbers guides you to something to look for in the text. You look at it and you make some conclusions.